We have completed the Old Testament basic stages in the Book of Ages. We had the creation, we had the patriarchs, we had the Exodus, the conquest, the judges, united and divided kingdom, the captivity, the return, and that brought us to the end of the New Testament. There are three other stages, but we will save them for New Testament. And what's curious now is we have this period that theologians have called the 400 silent years. It is a time from the day that Malachi put down his pen to the announcement of the birth of John the Baptist. And so for 400 years, we have no direct message from God through a true prophet. The reason this is important is because there's so much difference between Old Testament culture as we read it and New Testament culture. So the situation in which Nehemiah or Malachi finds himself is radically different than the land around the birth of Christ. And so a lot of things happen during the 400 silent years. And so we want to spend a little bit of time talking about what those things are, because while the prophet of God might have been silent, there was a lot of things happening, believe me. Here's a little timeline that gets us through. So what would be good is not necessarily having to memorize the dates at this point, but just simply to know what is going to follow next. So in 586 BC, Jerusalem falls, as we've already described. And then in 539 BC, Babylon falls to Persia. So we see an empire change from Babylon to Persia. This is the difference between Belshazzar in one chapter of Daniel and Darius in the next chapter of Daniel. So that's what we have going on. 539 BC is that event. And then Persia falls to Alexander in the 330s. So we put 331 BC, which Persia falls to Greece under Alexander. In 323, Alexander dies, and so the empire gets divided up between his four generals. So the two that we are interested in will be the General Seleucus and the General Ptolemy. Each of those get lands that will one day control Palestine. So when they divide up the Greek Empire between those four generals, Palestine is given to the chunk that Ptolemy gets. And so for a long time, from 323 to 198, Palestine is ruled by the Ptolemies. In 198, the Syrian Empire, the Seleucid Empire, from Seleucus the general, comes down, fights Ptolemy, and gains control of Palestine. So he rules it until about 164, 163, in which we have the Maccabean revolt, and we have an independent state slowly growing out of Syrian influence, out of Ptolemaic influence, until eventually they become a vassal of Rome in 63 BC. And then Herod begins to work his way in. First, Herod supports the Ptolemies, and then when the war between Rome and the Ptolemies shows a clear victory for Rome, Herod heads straight for Rome and reminds them, just as I was loyal to Mark Antony, so I will be loyal to you. And he is so convincing, careful, cunning, conniving, even diplomat, finds himself then in control of Palestine. So that's a timeline of the things that happened in between the end of Malachi and the beginning of Matthew. So let's look at them a little closer. What we want to see as a theme throughout this period, and as we look at the Apocrypha next week, and as we've already seen in the books of Daniel and Esther, the Jews are learning to live in a pagan world. wanting to maintain their Jewish identity, wanting to maintain their relationship with God, and yet being pressured, or even, as we'll see with the Seleucids, being coerced, forced to become Greek under pain of death. This process of learning Greek culture and literature and art and philosophy is called Hellenization. Hellenization means that wherever Alexander's armies went, they wanted to spread the good news of Greek culture. So worship Greek gods, read Greek books, create Greek art, pick up especially Greek political ideas, Greek philosophy, and so all of this was made available to wherever they went. So Hellenization didn't just take place in Palestine. It took place wherever there was a conquered country by Greece. They wanted to make them Greek citizens. So we'll see when the generals take over, Ptolemy spreads Greek culture in Palestine, but it is more of an influence, something you might be tempted by, something you could see the benefits of. Under Antiochus and Seleucid culture, it becomes much more forced, much more coerced as he tries to make those unruly Jews come into line with his goals for expansion of the Seleucid Empire. So how would you work through those Greek culture ideas and still remain faithful to Christ? Good question for our day as we look at our own kind of Hellenization. What things does our culture force upon us? Do we see the benefits of? Do we perhaps move away from what Scripture clearly teaches in order to embrace those things that society now teaches? We have our own Hellenization going on. So when the empire is divided up and Greece, the four generals take their place, Palestine is under the control of the Ptolemies. And this lasts for almost, 200 years? I'm not good at math. But during that time, the Jews remained largely faithful to their religious practices. The Ptolemies gave them freedom to worship, and the Jews, by and large, lived contentedly under their rule, though the social influence of Hellenization still crept in and began to change Jews as they learned to value this thing, that thing, the politics, the culture, the prosperity. And so there was economic and political benefits that the Jews saw, and many did become more Hellenized. When the Seleucids, however, took control of Palestine, when Antiochus III defeated the Ptolemies and took control of Judea, he wanted to Hellenize Judea and remove any features of Judaism because Judaism was exclusive. It demanded certain things, and he wanted to make Judaism the same as every other accepted religion. And this created a growing friction between Jews who saw the benefits in Hellenization and pious Jews who tried to remain faithful to the Torah. And this was exacerbated when Antiochus IV took a bribe and put a Hellenized Jewish person into the position of high priest. So he put Jason, who did have some lineage to the role as high priest. He was a Zadokite. Antiochus is later going to add Menelaus, who has no lineage, but is high priest anyway. Antiochus, we're going to see in perhaps another video, that Antiochus IV was quite the person who tried to mold himself after Alexander. He had great expansion plans. He thought of himself very highly. In fact, he was called Antiochus IV or Antiochus Epiphanes or Antiochus Theos Epiphanes, which means the God revealed, the epiphany of who God is. And so Antiochus had great expansion desires, great desires to be thought of as a god. And so he pushed, and it turns out that Antiochus spent a lot of his reign being cash strapped, needing to pay off Rome, needing to pay off his plans. And so we'll see that he's often trying to squeeze Palestine to get an extra dime to do this or that in the war against Egypt or in some other place. So Antiochus has clear designs to shut down exclusivistic, faithful to the Torah Judaism. And one of the things that he sets out to do is to build a gymnasium right outside the temple. And then to require everybody who could afford it to go to the gymnasium at least once. Problem was, when you went to the gymnasium to run, to exercise, you went naked. And pious Jews rebelled against that. It was against the Torah to appear publicly naked, they said. And so this was Antiochus trying to force Hellenization on the Jews at exactly a point of contention. This led to a rebellion which hardened Antiochus against the Jews and caused him to come in and to defile the temple. This is, according to what Daniel writes, the abomination that causes desolation. It is the desolating sacrifice, the sacrilege, and as a result of that, it is what Daniel predicted, and Antiochus is the cause for that during his reign. He then began to send people in to the country to force sacrifice and to, by persecution, to spread Hellenization. And there was one particular country priest, his name was Mattathias. He's going to play a huge role in just a minute. But for now, he's a country priest who an official came and ordered him to sacrifice an animal to an idol. And he refused to do so. And another Jew stepped forward to do it in his place, and he killed the officer making the demand. And he shouted, "Everyone who is zealous for the law and who stands by the covenant, follow me." And thus begins a Jewish rebellion. First, that rebellion is bent more toward the Jews who were Hellenistic. So it was an intramural argument and revolt in order that somehow there might be what we might call revival, that there might be a return and a restoration to the values of Torah. And this is what Mattathias and this is what his 5 sons desire to accomplish. The sons, in turn, are John, Simon, Judah, Eleazar, and Jonathan. And when we talk about the Maccabees in particular next week, we will see that they have continuing roles to play in the Hasmonean dynasty. So Mattathias starts this revolt, and he ends up having to face the power of the Seleucid army in Judea. And so the problem that Antiochus faces is he thinks this is no big deal, and so he uses less accomplished generals to come down and try to put Mattathias back under his control. And as a result, it gives Mattathias and his sons some wiggle room, and they keep getting defeated, these generals. So finally, the best general, Lysias, is sent, and first Mattathias meets him in guerrilla warfare, followed by open battle. The Maccabees were famous for guerrilla warfare, and then when they finally met the army in open battle, they were victorious, and it led to a Seleucid defeat, driving them out of Jerusalem and getting the opportunity to rededicate the temple, to erase everything that Antiochus had done there, and to clean it out and to begin to offer sacrifices again alone to the God of the Jews. This happened, oddly enough, on December 25th, 165 BC. This led to an 8-day celebration that is still observed called Hanukkah. So there we are. That's the story of the Maccabees, and we'll get to it in more detail next week. But after they wrest control from the Seleucids, they are able to reign on their own from 167 BC to 37 BC. And during that time, Syrian Seleucid power diminishes, and from 110 to 63, they are an independent state. And then in 63, Rome comes to power. But Judea is able to become independent, and when we call them Maccabeans, it's a name drawn from the Hebrew word for hammer. But that is the way Mattathias saw his revolt, and turns out pretty good description, as it were. All right, and then Rome makes Judea a vassal kingdom in 63, so it's still independent, but it now falls under the control of Rome, and Rome will eventually give Judea to Herod to control, even though Herod, I mentioned this earlier, fought on the side of Ptolemy first, on the side of Mark Antony, and then switched when the war was over, ran to Rome, convinced Caesar that he could be a loyal, faithful vassal to Caesar, just like he had been to Mark Antony. And so he is given Palestine again to rule as a result of that trip. So there we are. Quick survey through the Intertestamental Period, from Greece to the division of Greece to the Seleucids wresting control of Palestine away from the Ptolemies, to the Maccabees wresting control of Judea from the Syrians, the Seleucids, and then that dynasty becoming a vassal of Rome, and Herod being able to take control under Roman authority for Judea. And that, you see, sounds much more familiar to our understanding of the beginning of the New Testament. So, hope that's a good little help to get you through the intertestamental period. We'll go back now and talk about the Maccabees in another video, and then we'll talk about the Herods as we begin to set us up for our study of the New Testament and the final 3 stages in Wilmington's basic stages in the Book of Ages. Thanks for listening.